The invitation arrived on a Tuesday morning embossed in gold foil, and the moment Marisol Ferreira read the words, "You're cordially invited to celebrate the wedding of Tiago Nogueira," her hands went cold. 3 years. 3 years since he'd walked out on her when she was 6 months pregnant with triplets, telling her that a broke nobody wasn't the life he wanted. 3 years since he'd vanished into the glittering world of his new fiancé's family fortune, leaving Marisol to raise 3 infants alone in a cramped apartment with barely enough money for formula. And now here it was, an invitation dripping with cruelty disguised as courtesy, because she just knew. Tiago hadn't sent it out of nostalgia. He'd sent it to watch her crumble in front of everyone who once pitied her. If this story is touching your heart already, hit that like button. Drop a comment telling us you believe in kindness and second chances. Share this with someone who needs hope today, and subscribe to Whispering Tales Stories so you never miss a story like this one. Marisol sat at her kitchen table long after the sun set that evening, the invitation trembling between her fingers as her 3-year-old triplets, Rafael, Vitor, and little Camila, slept soundly in the next room. She remembered the early days after Tiago left, how she'd scrubbed floors at a laundromat until midnight, how she'd taught herself bookkeeping from library books while nursing 3 hungry babies at once, how there were nights she'd cried into a pillow so her children wouldn't hear her heart breaking. She remembered the whispers at church, the pitying looks from neighbors, the way Tiago's family had looked through her like she was invisible, like she'd never mattered at all. But somewhere in that darkness, something in Marisol had refused to stay broken. She started small, bookkeeping for a local bakery, then 2 businesses, then 5, until 3 years later she owned her own accounting firm that served half the small businesses in the city, and quietly, without anyone in Tiago's circle knowing, she'd become a wealthy woman in her own right. She almost threw the invitation away. But then she thought of her children, of the day they'd grow old enough to ask about their father, and she thought of the quiet, burning need to show up not for revenge but for closure, to prove to herself more than anyone that she had survived and thrived without him. So she wrote back a simple, gracious acceptance and began to prepare, not with anger but with dignity. The wedding took place on a golden Saturday afternoon at a sprawling vineyard estate outside the city, the kind of place with manicured gardens and champagne fountains that Marisol once could only dream of affording. Guests arrived in designer gowns and tailored suits, laughter tinkling like crystal glasses under the warm afternoon sun. Tiago stood near the altar in a crisp white tuxedo, looking every bit the triumphant groom, his bride's family fortune practically radiating off him. He told mutual friends loud enough for word to travel that his ex-wife was invited just to see how far he'd come, expecting her to arrive timid, worn down perhaps in a borrowed dress, begging silently for scraps of the life he'd denied her. Instead, when Marisol's car pulled up, a sleek black vehicle driven by a hired chauffeur, gasps rippled through the crowd gathering near the entrance. She stepped out wearing an elegant emerald gown that moved like water, her hair swept up, diamonds catching the afternoon light at her ears. Understated but unmistakably real. But it wasn't her appearance that silenced the garden. It was the 3 children walking beside her, dressed in matching cream outfits, holding her hands, their faces so strikingly similar to Tiago's that no one in that crowd needed an introduction to know exactly whose children they were. Tiago's smile faltered instantly. His bride's family exchanged confused glances, murmurs rippling outward like a stone thrown into still water. Marisol walked forward with the calm grace of a woman who had nothing left to prove and everything to protect. Her chin lifted, her steps unhurried, her children's small hands warm in hers. She greeted the wedding coordinator politely, thanked her for the invitation, and took her seat near the back, composed and radiant, while behind her the whispers grew louder. Who is she? Are those his children? Why did no one know? The story he'd spent 3 years constructing, the story of a self-made man who'd left behind nothing but an ungrateful past, was unraveling in real time in front of the very people he'd wanted to impress most. During the reception, Tiago's new mother-in-law approached Marisol, her voice tight with barely contained shock, asking who she was and why her children looked so much like the groom. Marisol answered honestly and without malice, explaining simply that she was Tiago's first wife, and that Rafael, Vitor, and Camila were his children. born after he'd chosen to leave rather than stay for their birth. She said it without bitterness, without raising her voice, without theatrics, and somehow that made it land harder than any scream ever could have. The woman's face drained of color as she turned to look at her daughter, radiant in her wedding gown, utterly unaware that the man she just married had an entire abandoned family sitting 3 tables away. Tiago found Marisol near the garden fountain an hour later, his jaw tight, his voice low and venomous as he accused her of trying to ruin his wedding, of showing up uninvited to humiliate him. Marisol looked at him then, really looked at him, this man who once held her heart and shattered it into 1,000 pieces, and felt something she hadn't expected to feel. Not rage, not sorrow, but a quiet, overwhelming peace. She told him gently that she hadn't come to humiliate anyone, that he had sent the invitation himself, and that perhaps some part of him had wanted his children to know him, even if he couldn't admit it to himself. She told him that Raphael had his laugh, that Vitor had his stubborn streak, that Camilla had his eyes, and that they asked about him sometimes, innocently the way children do, wondering why they didn't have a father like their friends did. Tiago's anger cracked then just slightly, just enough for Marisol to see the shame buried underneath it. The shame of a man who had built a glittering new life on the foundation of running away from the one that mattered most. As the sun began sinking low over the vineyard, casting the sky in soft amber and rose, little Camilla tugged at Marisol's dress and pointed toward Tiago, asking in her small, innocent voice if that man was her daddy, because he looked just like the picture Mommy kept in the drawer. The garden went silent around them. Tiago's new wife, who had overheard everything by then, stood frozen near the altar flowers, her bouquet trembling slightly in her hands, staring at the husband she'd married only hours earlier, as though seeing him for the first time. Marisol knelt down to Camilla's level, brushing a strand of hair from her daughter's face, and told her softly that sometimes grown-ups make choices they regret, but that it never changed how loved she was, how loved all 3 of them were, every single day of their lives. She told her children that a family isn't defined by who leaves, but by who stays, who shows up, who chooses you again and again even when it's hard. And in that golden light, surrounded by strangers who had come to celebrate a wedding and instead witness the quiet unraveling of a lie, Marisol Ferreira realized that she had already won, not because she'd humiliated her ex-husband, but because she had built something unbreakable out of the very ashes he'd left behind. She didn't need his money, his name, or his belated guilt. She had raised 3 extraordinary children on her own strength, built an empire with her own 2 hands, and walked into that garden not as a broken woman seeking validation, but as living proof that resilience could outshine any betrayal. If this story touched your heart even a little, please take a moment to like this video and share it with someone who needs to hear that second chances and quiet strength can rebuild a shattered life. Comment below with the word strength if you believe Marisol did the right thing by showing up with grace instead of anger, and let us know what you would have done in her place. As Marisol gathered her children to leave the reception that evening, Raphael slipped his small hand into hers and asked if they could come back home now, back to their cozy apartment above the bakery she used to work for, the one she now owned outright. She smiled down at him, at all 3 of her children, her whole trembling, beautiful world, and told him yes. They were going home, to the place where they were already whole, already enough, already loved beyond measure. And as their car pulled away from the vineyard, leaving behind the shattered illusions of a man who had chosen wealth and image over his own flesh and blood, Marisol Ferreira drove into the sunset with her children laughing softly in the backseat, carrying with her not bitterness but the quiet, unshakable knowledge that she had built a life worth so much more than any wedding, any fortune, any man who had once believed she was worth leaving behind.